In the fall of 2019, I moved from rural Tennessee to a small town outside of Portland, Oregon. I was 22, broke, and desperate to get away from my hometown after a bad breakup and a long stretch of depression. I found a cheap basement apartment attached to a large old house owned by a retired man named Walter. Walter lived upstairs alone with his golden retriever, Benny. He was quiet but kind, always offering me coffee whenever we crossed paths in the driveway. The rent was unbelievably low for the area, which should have been my first warning sign. The apartment itself was strange. It had low ceilings, narrow hallways, and this damp, earthy smell that never fully disappeared no matter how much bleach I used. There was only one tiny window in the bedroom, positioned near the ceiling at ground level. If someone stood outside, I could only see their legs. Walter explained that the house had originally been built in the 1940s and had gone through several additions over the years. He joked that the place was a maze held together by nails and luck. At first, everything felt normal. I worked evenings at a grocery store and usually got home around midnight. Most nights, I'd microwave food, watch YouTube, and fall asleep on the couch. Then I started hearing noises. Not loud noises, tiny noises, scratching, movement in the walls, soft creaks above my bedroom ceiling. I assumed it was mice or old pipes. Walter certainly didn't seem concerned when I mentioned it. Old houses breathe, he told me casually. But over time, the noises became harder to explain. One night while brushing my teeth, I distinctly heard footsteps in the hallway outside the bathroom. Slow footsteps, like someone carefully shifting their weight. I opened the door immediately. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the motion sensor light near the kitchenette was on. I remember standing there frozen, staring at that yellow light humming softly above the sink. I knew I hadn't turned it on. After that, I became hyper-aware of everything. I started noticing tiny things moved around my apartment. Kitchen drawers slightly open.
Cabinet doors cracked at odd angles.
A dining chair pulled farther out than I remembered. At first I blamed myself. I worked long shifts and barely slept. Then my food started disappearing. Not entire meals, just small amounts. A slice of bread, half a soda, a handful of cereal. The creepiest part was that nothing valuable was ever touched. My laptop, cash, and gaming console all stayed exactly where they were. One Saturday night, I came home early because my manager let me leave before closing. As I walked down the exterior stairs toward my basement entrance, I noticed my apartment light flick off through the blinds. I froze halfway down the steps. I knew for a fact I'd left the kitchen light on. My stomach dropped. I stood there silently listening. First, nothing. Then, a faint thud from inside. I backed away slowly and called Walter. He came outside in pajama pants holding an old revolver. Together we unlocked the door and entered. The apartment was empty. No broken windows. No signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. But the bathroom sink was running. Walter frowned and shut it off. "Probably forgot it," he muttered. I knew I hadn't. That night I barely slept. Around 3 a.m., I woke up needing to pee. As I shuffled toward the bathroom half asleep, I noticed something that made every hair on my body stand up. The closet door near my bedroom was slightly open. I always kept it closed because the hinges squealed loudly. I stared at the darkness inside for several seconds. Then I heard breathing. Not mine. Someone else's. Slow.
Wet.
Deliberate. I ran. I sprinted out the apartment barefoot and pounded on Walter's front door screaming. He came outside terrified, Benny barking wildly behind him. The police arrived 15 minutes later. 2 officers searched the apartment thoroughly. Again, they found nothing. One officer even checked the closet while I watched from the hallway. Empty. But as they prepared to leave, Benny suddenly began growling at the closet wall itself. Not inside the closet. The wall. Walter frowned. "There's no space behind there," he said. But the officer knocked against it anyway. Most of it sounded solid. Except for one section. Hollow. The officer's expression changed instantly. They pulled the closet shelf down and discovered a narrow wooden panel hidden behind hanging jackets. It opened into a dark crawl space between the walls. The smell that came out nearly made me vomit. Rotting food, sweat, mold. Flashlights revealed blankets, empty cans, water bottles, and piles of garbage shoved deep into the narrow space. Someone had absolutely been living in there, watching me, listening to me, sleeping feet away from my bed. I remember one officer crawling deeper into the space while another stayed with me outside. Then we heard him yell, "Holy shit!" They found photographs, hundreds of them, printed pictures of me, leaving for work, sleeping on the couch, cooking. Even one photo taken from beside my bed while I was asleep. The timestamps stretched back nearly 4 months. I started shaking uncontrollably, but the worst part hadn't come yet. The officer crawled farther toward the rear of the house and suddenly shouted for backup. The crawl space connected to more hidden compartments running through the walls of the entire basement. And at the far end, they found a man, curled up in darkness, watching them. The officer later told me the guy didn't panic or run. He just stared silently with huge bloodshot eyes. He looked almost feral. Filthy beard, sunken cheeks, shoes wrapped in duct tape. When they dragged him out, he kept muttering one sentence over and over. "She wasn't supposed to know." Turns out the man had once worked construction on the house years earlier during renovations. He apparently knew about the hidden maintenance spaces inside the walls and had been secretly living there after becoming homeless. The police believed he entered while Walter was away visiting family weeks before I moved in. But they also discovered something even more horrifying. The hidden panel inside my closet could only be opened from inside the crawl space. Meaning every single time I found it cracked open, he had been standing in my room, watching me sleep. I moved out 2 days later. Walter sealed the crawl spaces completely and sold the house 6 months after the incident. But even now, years later, I still cannot sleep if a closet door is open. And sometimes when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I still hear breathing in the dark. Back in 2021, I lived in a small neighborhood outside of Cleveland, Ohio with my older brother Marcus. We rented a narrow duplex on a quiet dead-end street filled with identical houses and old maple trees. Nothing exciting ever happened there. Most of the neighbors were retirees who spent their evenings gardening or watching TV with their curtains open. Across from us lived an older man named Richard. At least that's what everyone called him. Richard rarely came outside during the day, but every evening around sunset, he would sit on his porch smoking cigarettes silently for hours. At first, he seemed harmless. Then weird things started happening. It began with our trash cans. Every Tuesday morning after garbage pickup, we'd find our cans moved from the curb back beside the house. We assumed a nice neighbor was helping us out. Then one evening Marcus asked me why I'd been standing outside his bedroom window the night before. I laughed because I thought he was joking. "I wasn't outside your window." He went quiet. Then he said something that made my stomach tighten. Well, somebody was. Apparently around 2 a.m., he woke up and saw a silhouette standing outside the side yard near his window, just standing there motionless, watching. By the time he got up to check, the figure was gone. A week later, I had my own experience. I was gaming late at night with headphones on when I got thirsty and walked into the kitchen. As I passed the front window, I noticed someone standing across the street. Richard. Except something felt wrong. He wasn't on his porch. He was standing in the middle of his lawn, perfectly still, facing our house. I don't know how long he'd been there. The weirdest part was the time. It was almost 3:30 in the morning. I watched him for maybe 10 seconds before he slowly raised one arm and pointed toward our house. Not waved, pointed. I immediately backed away from the window. The next morning his lawn was empty again. I told Marcus, but he just shrugged it off and said the guy was probably senile. Still, I started noticing Richard more and more after that. Whenever I left for work, he'd peek through his blinds. If I checked the mail, I'd sometimes see him standing at his doorway watching silently. One afternoon, I caught him photographing our house with an old camcorder. When I confronted him, he acted confused and claimed he was testing zoom levels. Marcus wanted to report him, but technically the guy hadn't done anything illegal. Then came the knocking. Every few nights around 1 o'clock or 2 a.m., we'd hear 3 knocks at the front door. Always exactly 3. The first time it happened, Marcus opened the door immediately. Nobody there. The second time, we checked through the peephole first. Again, nobody. The third time, Marcus flung the door open fast enough to catch movement. Someone sprinting across the street, straight toward Richard's house. At that point, we installed a doorbell camera. For almost 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then finally, one night, the alert went off around 2:17 a.m. Marcus and I watched the live feed from his room. The porch was empty, but the motion sensor kept triggering. Then suddenly, a face appeared inches from the camera. Richard, smiling. Not a normal smile either. Wide, too wide, like he was forcing it. He leaned close to the camera and whispered something we couldn't fully understand. Then he knocked 3 times, slowly, before walking away. We called police immediately. An officer visited Richard's house the next morning, but according to him, Richard denied everything. The officer suggested maybe he was lonely or mentally unstable. A few nights later, things escalated badly. I woke up around 4 a.m. needing the bathroom. As I crossed the hallway, I noticed the front door was slightly open. Marcus always locked it. Always. My chest tightened instantly. I woke him up and grabbed a baseball bat while he called 911. We searched the downstairs together. Nothing missing. No one inside. But muddy footprints stretched from the front door through the living room and stopped outside my bedroom. Not inside. Outside. Like whoever entered had simply stood there watching me sleep. Police searched again but found nothing useful besides partial prints. One officer asked whether we knew Richard. When we explained everything, his expression changed slightly. Turns out police had responded to several strange complaints about him over the years. Trespassing, peeping into windows, recording neighbors, but never enough evidence for charges. The officers went to question him again. This time no one answered. They eventually entered the house after noticing a terrible smell coming from inside. What they found still makes me sick thinking about it. The entire house was covered wall to wall in photographs. Thousands of them. Every neighbor on the street. Pictures through windows. People sleeping, eating dinner, changing clothes, children playing outside. Entire routines documented obsessively for years. And in the basement, they found a hidden room dedicated entirely to our house. Maps, schedules, printed screenshots from our social media accounts, pages of handwritten notes describing our daily routines in disturbing detail. But Richard himself was gone. Police searched for weeks without finding him. Then one night, nearly a month later, Marcus came home from work pale as a ghost. Someone had left an envelope under his windshield wiper. Inside was a recent photograph of me sleeping in my bed. On the back, written in shaky handwriting, were 4 words. Windows work both ways. We moved out 3 days later. Richard was never found. And even now, whenever I pass a house with open curtains at night, I can't stop wondering who might be standing outside in the dark watching back. In October of 2022, I moved to a tiny town in northern Vermont after getting hired as a night dispatcher for a trucking company. I was 24 years old, recently single, and honestly desperate for a fresh start. The town itself was quiet to the point of feeling frozen in time. One grocery store, one gas station, one diner where every old man seemed to know each other by name. Finding a place to rent there was difficult, especially with my budget. Eventually, I found an old duplex at the very end of Blackwood Lane. The rent was suspiciously cheap compared to everything else, but after seeing enough overpriced dumps, I didn't care anymore. The landlord, a thin older woman named Miriam, met me outside the property the first day. The house looked unsettling immediately. Not haunted movie unsettling. Worse, neglected unsettling. The white paint was peeling off in long strips. The porch sagged slightly in the middle. One upstairs window was boarded shut from the inside, and there were strange dark stains running beneath the gutters like something had leaked down the walls for years. Still, the inside wasn't terrible. Outdated but livable. The duplex had 2 units connected by a shared wall. Mine was on the left side. According to Miriam, the other side had been empty for almost a year. That detail made me feel better. No noisy neighbors. No shared drama. Perfect. Before leaving, Miriam hesitated by the front door like she wanted to say something else. Finally, she just smiled nervously and said, "If you hear noises through the walls, just ignore them. Old pipes travel sounds strangely in this house." At the time, I laughed. I wish I hadn't. For the first couple of weeks, everything was normal. I worked night shifts from 8 p.m. to 5 a.m., slept through most of the day, and spent evenings gaming or watching horror videos before work. The neighborhood itself felt dead after dark. No traffic. No dogs barking. Nothing. Just whined through the trees. Then the noises started. At first, it was soft thumping from the other side of the duplex. Not constant, just random bumps late at night. I assumed maybe Miriam was renovating the empty unit. But the noises slowly became more specific. Footsteps.
Cabinet d'orcheting.
Something dragging across the floor. One night around 3 a.m., while eating leftovers in my kitchen before work, I distinctly heard a woman laughing through the wall. Not TV laughter. Real laughter. Low and quiet. I froze mid-bite. The sound stopped instantly. I stood there listening for almost a minute before finally convincing myself I was overtired. The next day, I texted Miriam asking if someone had moved into the other unit. Her response came quickly. No. Still empty. That answer bothered me more than it should have. Over the next month, the sounds continued. Always at night. Always when I was alone. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps pacing slowly beside my bedroom wall. Other times I'd hear what sounded like whispering. I started sleeping with a fan on just to drown it out. Then one night I came home from work and found my bathroom mirror covered in steam. Not a little fog. Completely steamed over like someone had taken a long hot shower. The bathroom itself felt humid. I knew for a fact I hadn't left anything running. I checked every faucet. Dry. But written faintly in the steam were 4 words. "Can you hear me?" I nearly threw up. I wiped the mirror down immediately and called Miriam in a panic. She arrived 20 minutes later wearing slippers and a heavy winter coat. When I showed her the mirror, her expression changed instantly. Not confusion. Recognition. That scared me more than anything. She quietly asked, "Did you write it?" I told her obviously not. For several seconds, she just stared at the mirror silently. Then she said something that still haunts me. "You shouldn't answer if it happens again." Before I could ask what the hell she meant, she abruptly left. I barely slept after that. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. No footsteps. No whispers. Nothing. Then came the smell. I woke up around noon one afternoon to an awful odor filling my apartment. Rotting. sweet and sour at the same time. I checked my fridge, trash, sinks, everything. Nothing. The smell seemed strongest near the hallway closet beside my bedroom. When I opened it, I noticed something strange immediately. The back wall looked uneven, like someone had patched part of it poorly. The wallpaper pattern didn't line up correctly either. I pushed against the wall gently. It moved. My stomach tightened instantly. I grabbed a screwdriver and peeled part of the loose panel away. Behind it was darkness. Not insulation. Not pipes. An empty space. I widened the opening enough to shine my phone flashlight inside. It revealed a narrow passageway between the walls. And deep inside, a chair, facing directly toward a small vent opening into my bedroom. I slammed the panel shut so hard I nearly broke it. Then I called the police. 2 officers arrived about 30 minutes later. At first, they seemed skeptical, until they opened the hidden panel themselves. One officer crawled partially inside with a flashlight. Almost immediately, he backed out looking disturbed. There were blankets inside, food wrappers, water bottles, and dozens of cigarette butts. Someone had absolutely been living in the walls. The passageway extended farther than expected too. Apparently, the entire duplex shared an interconnected maintenance space running between both units. The officers searched for over an hour. Nobody was found, but they did discover something horrifying. In the abandoned unit next door, several vents had been removed. Small viewing holes had been carved through the drywall. Whoever lived there had access to nearly every room in my apartment without me realizing it. The police believed it was likely a homeless drifter using the empty unit and wall spaces to hide. They advised me to stay elsewhere temporarily. I packed a bag and spent the weekend at a coworker's apartment. When I returned Monday morning, the first thing I noticed was my front door slightly open. I knew I'd locked it. Every light inside was off. My heart immediately started pounding. I called out from outside. No answer. Slowly, I pushed the door open wider. The apartment looked normal at first glance, until I noticed the kitchen table. Someone had placed photographs across it. Pictures of me, sleeping on the couch, leaving for work, standing in the kitchen. Some were clearly taken from inside the apartment, others from outside my windows at night. My hands started shaking so badly I dropped my keys. Then I noticed the final photograph sitting separately near the edge of the table. It showed me sleeping in bed from only a few feet away. And standing beside my bed was a tall, dark figure staring directly into the camera. I ran outside immediately and called police again. This time they searched more aggressively. The hidden passageways, the attic, the crawl space beneath the house. That's where they finally found him. Underneath the duplex was a dirt crawl space barely tall enough to move through on hands and knees. The officers discovered a makeshift living area hidden deep beneath my bedroom. Blankets, cans of food, batteries, and dozens more photographs pinned to wooden beams. But the man himself had vanished again. The scariest part? The crawl space connected directly to a loose vent beneath my bedroom floor. Whoever he was had been sleeping underneath me almost every night. Police launched a full investigation after that. Turns out the abandoned side of the duplex had once belonged to a man named Daniel Reese. According to neighbors, Daniel lived there alone for years before suddenly disappearing sometime in 2021. Nobody officially reported him missing because he had no family nearby and rarely interacted with anyone. Miriam eventually confessed that she suspected Daniel had secretly continued living somewhere on the property after his eviction, but she was too afraid to investigate herself. Apparently, tenants before me had also reported strange noises. One even claimed someone whispered through the vents at night, but nobody ever found proof. 3 nights later, everything finally exploded. I was staying at a motel 20 minutes away, when I got a call from police around 1:30 a.m. Someone had broken back into my apartment. Neighbors reported seeing movement inside despite the property being temporarily vacant. This time officers surrounded the duplex before entering. And finally, they found him, hidden inside the wall passage behind my bathroom. The officer later described him as looking barely human. Long, filthy hair, sunken eyes, gray skin. He was incredibly thin and covered in scratches and bruises. When officers dragged him out, he screamed violently and kept repeating the same sentence over and over. She wasn't supposed to leave. The police later confirmed it really was Daniel Reese. He had somehow survived for nearly a year living inside the duplex walls, stealing food from nearby homes and occasionally sneaking into my apartment while I worked nights. What horrified investigators most was how organized he'd become. He had mapped my schedule perfectly, knew exactly when I left for work, knew when I slept, knew which floorboards creaked. According to police, he'd become obsessed with me because I reminded him of his ex-girlfriend. I moved out immediately after the investigation ended. The duplex was eventually demolished months later after inspectors found extensive hidden structural damage and unauthorized crawl spaces throughout the property. But even now, the smallest sounds inside walls make my blood run cold. And sometimes late at night, when pipes creak in my apartment building, I remember something one officer told me before I left Vermont. He said, "You'd be surprised how long someone can live inside a house without being noticed."